Welcome to Radio Omnicore. Today I'm excited to introduce you to Grant Strong. He's a clinical psychologist and is also one of our executive coaches on our panel. Grant shares some fascinating ideas about coaching and therapy and how he applies his schema framework in the coaching context, and also how leaders can understand what drives and motivates their behaviors sometimes. I think you're going to find it really fascinating. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have Grant in the room. Hi, Hilton in the corner. Wonderful to be back for an episode, and we've waited long for this episode, Grant. I think we've been speaking about it for a while, and really excited to get into talking everything about the Schema Theory. But why don't we start off with just a little bit of an intro for the listeners? We love working with you, Grant. Your clients all rave about you, and I'm sure everyone's going to see why.
Thanks, Colleen. Hi, Hilton. It's lovely to be talking with you today. Yes, I've been waiting for this for a long time. So, maybe just by way of introduction, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm based in Johannesburg. And in the last couple of years, I've gotten more involved with executive coaching and really found my niche, I would say, around self-leadership development and working with the principle of lead yourself first, really. And so that's how I got into doing a bit of clinical work, but then also working within the corporate space, helping executives develop.
So maybe just, Hilton, do you want to kick off from your side what you want to introduce, ask any questions about the theory? You can kick off with some definitions maybe.
Well, I think we're just keen to kind of get the broad principles of ego states and the way that you use them.
Certainly. I positioned this against the backdrop of why bring a theory like schema theory into an executive coaching space? What is that all about? And Hilton, I position it against the backdrop of, well, if you're working with self-leadership development, if you're working with the self, and so aiming the lens completely at the individual just for a moment. And we know that there are other executive coaching approaches that focuses on teams and the broader organization. But when we focus on the self, we really need to kind of contextualize and understand what it is that we're working with and what is required. So I'll maybe start you off with just a little bit of a definition of self-leadership. And what I could look around and find in the literature is that it focuses on self-awareness and setting goals for the self, honoring the self. And then it goes on to saying, being the change you want to see in the world. Now, when I hear that, I immediately go to, that is wonderful, but what is the empirical evidence and the evidence base for creating something? Because it almost sounds a little bit airy-fairy. And when I got into this work and I thought, well, I'm working with a human being, so I have to ground my understanding theoretically in a mechanism of change that's evidence-based and that's really going to give the person, the executive, and the organizational client a return on the investment. And I couldn't possibly do that if I didn't ground myself in something that's quite scientific and well researched. So drawing on the schema therapy framework and then using the theoretical aspects to address needs with my client base in this space, it just made sense to me. So getting into some definitions and understanding of the framework, that is one of the really good things about this approach, because it offers a language, not simply a language that the coach privately understands and almost take from a one-up position. And it also offers the client, the coachee that you're working with, a language that helps them understand themselves and become that mechanism for change. So broadly speaking, Hilton, a schema is a blueprint for our psyches. And when I say blueprint, I'm basically implying that there is a developmental process that happens in the young life of this leader. There's a window period of those formative years, and a schema starts to form and starts to concretize in the mind of this leader, and it stays with you. It stays with you regardless of how old you are, how many business school degrees you have, what positions you have in an organization. It becomes the personal frame of reference through which you engage the world and the people within your space. So your world views, for sure, in how you see everyone else, how you interpret situations and events. But it also becomes the self view for who you see yourself to be within those situations. And of course, now when we unpack it, there's going to be a number of elements that, guide our understanding of it further.
So Grant, I mean, when you talk about it in that way, it just reminds me so much of things like life scripts, narrative, psychotherapy, constructivism. All of those things seem to coalesce around worldview, the constructs that are created at some point in your life that you continue to reinforce. I mean, is it differentiated from those other models, or are the differentiations even important?
I think the differentiations, Hilton, are very important. So it starts off with a strong understanding base with some of the constructs that you refer to. But what I really love about this way of working is that it doesn't just offer us an understanding. Let me explain what I mean and why I'm emphasizing this. Most of the people we coach through your organization are very high-level executives, meaning they've got top quality education, top quality MBAs, they've studied at the best places, they've been around in the industries for a number of years and they've excelled. So the level of insight that you might be able to share with them in terms of life script, they probably heard it before. And they probably heard it before, a very long time ago already. And chances are that they've been trying to actively work and engage with it. So you're not telling them something new. Yeah, you're giving them new concepts and you're helping them conceptualize and understand their development that ultimately becomes the philosophical underpinnings of their leadership style. Well, what I love about this approach is that it goes beyond prefrontal cortex understanding into an experiential approach that you use to facilitate change. So I often say to people, listen, if you give me a few minutes, I love explaining stuff. It's just one of the things that I do. It plays into my coping elements, which I'll talk a bit about later within this theory. But that doesn't change anyone. Yeah, sure, it empowers people with a bit of insight and self-awareness, which self-leadership development speaks of. But it doesn't change anyone. And I mean, if you just think of the number of times you've sat with people in your coaching sessions who tell you, Hilton, I know I do this, but I don't know how to change it. That is where this framework comes in to offer value. Because we go into the mechanism of change that isn't just about understanding scripts anymore.
Okay.
Grant, you spoke earlier about addressing the individual's needs. And often when we're working with senior leaders, emotional regulation is one of the things that comes out potentially low. Has that got something to do with, well, if I don't understand my own needs and I can't self-regulate, how can I actually lead others?
Well, yes, I do make a very direct link with what you're saying, Colleen, because today we're talking at a very high level. We say, well, what compassion and empathy is the real differentiator with which we go and compete in the marketplace, and our clients' needs are fundamental to us, right? So, yes, I do take it quite literally that if we don't know how to engage with our own core emotional needs, we're going to be up against a lot to understand the needs of other people, be they within the workplace, within teams, with regards to executing culture, or anticipating what the needs of your clients are going to be within 5 to 10 years. It's going to be nearly impossible. And look, people do it all the time. They use all kinds of data-driven strategies to try and determine all that. But ultimately, good leadership for me is about understanding emotionally what the needs of others are.
So Grant, you were talking about the experiential component of your methodology. And maybe you could take us through what would you do with somebody who you're working with in implementing this methodology?
Okay, all right. So Let me talk a little bit about how I adapt the schema, because at the moment, there is no schema coaching literature really to speak of. And the reason I'm taking such liberties is because I'm using a clinical theory with my understanding of leadership, and I'm trying to build a bridge, maybe in some ways a little bit superficial, to have a model to guide the coaching that I do. But to simplify, I've based my interventions on 3 pillars, with 3 phases really, and don't look at them as linear, one comes after the other, more in a circular fashion. But these 3 pillars are really self-awareness, right? And so we speak about self-awareness. I try and orientate the person to how I understand their development, which ultimately becomes how they express their leadership. So we start with needs. And we say that a schema develops because of the unmet needs of a child, right? So what kind of needs am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about your need to have a safe attachment and just to feel safe within your existence and with the people in your world. I'm talking about your needs for healthy autonomy, developing a healthy relationship with performance and having a stable identity. And I'm talking about needs such as having realistic limits and self-control and how you learn to do that, because no child is just born with an innate ability, according to the approach that I take and I value, knowing how to do that. They need to be taught in the world. So if you're talking about an executive, for instance, who is constantly faced with HR disciplinary issues and there's an issue of self-control, we have to understand what the basics underpinnings are. I'm talking about the need to be able to freely express yourself and your emotions in realistically acceptable ways. And of course, spontaneity and play. We often emphasize that people don't know how to have fun and healthy fun, even as adults in an organizational setting. So it really starts, the essence of doing schema work, be it in therapy or be it in coaching at an executive level, starts with an understanding of the vulnerable child. And of course, in this language, we say it's a vulnerable child mode. So what was the state of this person? So with my executives, I'd like a high-level overview just of how that formative period of their lives were experienced, because we understand that when needs are not met, schemas develop. Now, Jeffrey Young in his work in the early sort of 90s, when he started developing this theory about schemas, he came up with 18, and still today there are still currently accepted 18 schemas, basically. So looking at a core belief, for instance, element of it, we can take a schema like emotional deprivation, which is one of the 18 schemas that he's identified. And the basis of it is that there's basically a frustration of the person's attachment needs being met. So how does it play out in an organization? Well, the executive that believes that there's no point in expressing what their needs are because nobody's going to be either capable or interested in meeting their needs. So it directly affects how behavior in terms of delegating, which ultimately becomes something like micromanaging. Or take the executive, for instance, who has this emotional deprivation schema, who believes that his needs cannot be met and works himself to the point of burnout. Right? So going back to the basic core fundamental level of what is the state of your vulnerable child mode is very important. And of course, people are not going to come to you and just hand you that information because they don't know it themselves. So it's part of the way we start to conceptualize what their coaching needs are about. But attached to this is a neurobiological process. Attached to the experience of not having your needs met is a neurobiological process which we understand as fight, flight, or freeze. And so just about everyone who's ever sat in some kind of workshop in an organization would have some idea about what fight, flight, and freeze are. And I often ask people, and they often tell me very accurately. Basically, it's what you see on National Geographic when you study animal behavior. Clearly, there are some of those animals that go into a fight mode quite easily, and those are usually more of a predatorial nature, right? But you also get those that flee and run away, and certainly those that freeze and get stunned in the face of threats and become immobilized. Now, we have those neurobiological responses, But at a very complex human level, it becomes more finely nuanced. So for instance, fight becomes control, which has various ways of being expressed in the world. So from micromanaging, from being quite perfectionistic in the way you do things, to sometimes bullying others and coming across in an attacking way verbally, sometimes physically, or someone who operates with the feeling that they're better than others. We call that in schema therapy being quite self-aggrandizing. It's understanding that the vulnerable child's needs were not met, and the natural response to this was to go into some kind of fight, flight, or freeze. Now, not everybody necessarily only has one predominant way in which they, go into a coping mechanism, which in the context of our conversation, I'm going to look at as a dysfunctional leadership behavior, right? Sometimes it's a repertoire of those fight, flight, and freeze interactions coming together in different ways. It's about being able to understand, okay, someone is in a flight mode right now, and how do I know that? Well, they're seeking distance. They're trying to get away from something or someone, and they're doing it in a particular kind of way. So again, there's a number of modes that we can look at. So mode is the key part of the puzzle that tells us where the person's ego state, as you put it, Hilton, earlier was. So for instance, they could become quite detached. So person could be sitting in a boardroom situation. People could be doing presentations about strategy, for example, and how they're going to move the organization forward. And the person could sit there being quite detached. Detached just meaning there's no emotional investment, right? There's no passion and all of those things that we talk about when we talk about self-leadership development. Or for instance, they're quite avoidant. So they're there, they show up and so on, but they don't take on things. They don't put up their hands, or they're quite reluctant when at a level of deliverables, the discussion is they're trying to get out of responsibilities and so forth. And it's very important to pinpoint when somebody is just being avoidant as a way of coping with some kind of threatening situation. People who go into a freeze mode, for instance, we don't say literally they become stunned, but psychologically speaking, we're saying they surrender. So they gave into the schema. So just to give you an example of another form of schema, punitiveness is one of the schemas that Jeffrey Young identified, right? And a punitive schema basically is the blueprint outlook on the world that says, I live in a harsh environment and I can expect to be punished whenever I make even the slightest mistake. Now, someone who interacts with that schema through a surrender mode is going to accept exactly that they're going to be a victim. They're going to be a sitting duck. And it's just a matter of time before management no longer supports me with the resources that I need to do my work. If they engage with it within a fight mode, for instance, they might say, well, this is where silo mentalities come in. They might say, I might be in marketing, whoever else is in another department. I'm going to go and fight because there's only so much resources in the world or in this company. If I don't get it first, someone's going to get it over me. So these everyday, interactions that we talk about in schema terms, they could be broken down to modes in which we are at the moment so that we can have conversations. Now, I've spoken about having the emotional vulnerability, Colleen, which is also the self-regulation that you've touched on. And I've spoken about the coping behavior, which ultimately we look at then as the leadership behavior. But there's a few additional modes that we must look at. So in the schema theory framework, we speak about an inner critic mode. Right now, again, this is not particular to the schema theory framework. Lots of people use those terms. But inner critic helps us to understand how this vulnerable child experienced authority and adult caregivers. And it speaks to what they internalize. So predominantly we work with two kinds of inner critic modes. We work with a demanding inner critic and we work with a punitive inner critic. So again, predominantly based on what this coachee has internalized. We've all worked at some point with a coachee who is past burnout, but is still pushing herself to wake up 4 o'clock in the morning, come home, get kids ready for school, all of those things, and still put her hand up every time in the meeting whenever there's tasks to be done, right? There's an inner critic mode operating as this person's cognitive filter between interpersonal relations that is of a demanding nature. That's telling her that unless she does this or achieves that, she's not good enough, right? And so we might say, okay, but as adults, we know that, it shouldn't be that way. The problem is, within our limbic systems, which is the seat of our emotional development, all right, those modes are quite raw. So the prefrontal cortex, all right, as it develops and reaches its adult maturity in your early 20s. And we metaphorically refer to that part of your brain as your healthy adult. Your healthy adult that can mitigate and negotiate and self-regulate all of these vulnerable child mode feelings and even the unhealthy coping modes that kick in as leadership behavior. The problem is it has to be learned. We're not born with those capacities. So by the time that our limbic systems reaches its adult form, we're really just children. We're really just 10, 11-year-olds running around in the world and not knowing how to self-regulate. So these inner critic modes have free reign. They're not something that go away neurally. They have very established pathways and networks within our brains that is going to be there for life. The best that we can do is help the coachee strengthen her healthy adult modes so that she's able to push those inner critic modes away, make her coping modes a bit more healthier. So we'll always have fight, flight, or freeze. But again, we can bring that to a scale of adaptability. Okay. So the next question that you might ask is, okay, well, how do we do all of this? Well, this is the complex. This is where the complexity comes in. So I've spoken about my 3-phase approach, right? I've spoken about self-awareness, and I might use, in conjunction with the 360 feedbacks that we do and the psychometric assessments, I might spend an entire session and just very simply and very visually unpacking this with a coaching. The second phase that we then move in is the experiential stuff, Hilton, that we spoke about a little bit earlier. Okay. And this is where it gets really exciting for me, because we get to do chair work, right? And we get to do imagery work as a way of activating those modes. So the schema-orientated coach does a number of things that other coaches do, which is to contain you, which is to provide a safe and a holding space. But we don't just want to be talking about these modes from a distance. We want to get them involved. Okay. And so I might say to a coach, we've been through some of the struggles that you've been having, and one of your goals is to be able to say no and to have boundaries at work. Okay. But notice how your inner critic makes that hard for you. Notice that every time that you want to do that, there's something that convinces you to go the other way. So we want to go and activate those modes, right? So we'll use a bit of chair work, and we'll say, well, I want you just to act out a little bit. Let's role play a little bit. You'll be the inner critic, and then I'll sit here kind of like listening to what your inner critic has to say. And when I first started working with the schema approach, I always imagined that people, especially adults, would have a lot of reluctance around this. Actually, they don't. Not in my experience. It might be for some other people, but people are, even executives themselves, are usually quite keen to get involved in this kind of work. So we do that, and I guide them, and many times they'll feel, but I can't really see what's the problem with my inner critic, because it's helping me to have high standards, it's helping me to deliver and all of this. And so you may have to just get in and correct them a little bit and help them understand that I'll do a role play next, and I'll be your inner critic mode. And then I'll start saying some of the things that they make reference to in our earlier conversations. And once they start feeling the impact, once you can say to them, let's just take a moment and see just what are you aware of in the body? Because this is where the experiential work gets done. What are you aware of right now as I said those things to you? Could you feel something change in your body? Just do a bit of a check-in. Just scan yourself from head to toe to see what's happening. And so sometimes they'll point to the stomach. Sometimes they'll point to the chest. Sometimes they'll point to the throat if it's really intense. And they'll say, well, I don't know why, but when you said that to me, I recognized that my body reacted. And that's a good opportunity sometimes to say, how often does this happen in the boardroom? How often does this happen when you're in that meeting with that client, right? Or when you're about to do a sales pitch, or something to that effect. And you start making the links and you start getting the buy-in, right? But where you're going with all of this is really towards that vulnerable child mode, to help the leader understand. And I take a bit of liberty with my language now, but I say that feeling that you're getting there, it's from your vulnerable child experiences of your needs not being met. In someone speaking to you in this way over your needs. Think of that as the little leader. And they go, okay, so it's me, this is the big leader, guy that wears the suit every day, goes to work and so on. But I take with me a little leader, an emotional component that sometimes reacts and sometimes puts it on display for everyone else to see. I know I shouldn't bully and attack people, and I get really embarrassed 15 minutes later when I've had an opportunity to calm down and think about it, but I can't stop it. I just don't know how to stop it. And so that's where we start getting the healthy adult involved. And mind you, this is now a process of a couple of sessions, because scheme-orientated work is actually long-term work, but we try and condense it to help give people tools, to be able to access the healthy adult and say, well, let's suppose in that situation where you were the vulnerable child, there was an uncle, there was a really responsible neighbor, someone who's really in tune with your feelings, that could step in and help you get your needs met. Let's see what that would feel like. And so that is where you can delve into the therapeutics of it, but from a leadership point of view, you want to be able to just help them make the links, help them get the inner critic under control.
I was just thinking, so can you change this? Because often clients will just say, well, I am what I am.
This is the nice thing. You can invite them and say, pull up a chair if you're working face-to-face, or if online, you say, okay, let's think about what you're saying. Pull up a chair. I want you to invite you as the co-coach, right? And then let's look at Colleen as she's sitting over there, right? You're the healthy adult next to me. I'm partnering up with you. When she's saying, I am what I am, given what you know now, in what mode do you think she's in? And so she might say, if she's got good insight and she's really open and so on, she might say, I think that's a self-aggrandizer mode, which is really based on lecturing everyone else and accepting no feedback and being quite dismissive. And then you can work from there and say, okay, well, the healthy leader side of you, how would you want to deal with that? What would be the way that you would like to go? And so it's also a nice way as a coach to start pointing out dysfunctional behavior using modes, because then it's not you that said it. It's you with the help of them that gets to point out parts of them, because that's really what our complexity as human beings are all about, is that there are parts to us. And some parts of us are really good and must be strengthened. Other parts of us needs to be reworked and self-regulated and set boundaries.
And so you're creating the self-awareness through these interactions.
Yes. So, and I often say to people, you've got the self-awareness component of it now. You've got a visual map. That's lifelong. That's for the rest of your development. That's for reference when you find yourself stuck, right? But we've got time-limited work in coaching due to constraint of resources and time, obviously. So we're not going to delve into deep child level work. So for instance, I was sitting with a coach of mine yesterday, and we had a bit of a break between our last session, which was aimed at self-awareness and how our modes work and inner criting. And sometimes I provide easy reference readings just to help people digest that. But when she came to the session yesterday, she was able to say, listen, I think I'm catching my inner critic out. And I'm learning to work with it a bit better, because I actually don't feel like I need to prove my worth in this organization anymore. The days when I used to leave here feeling that I haven't done enough, that I have to work myself to the point of burnout, or sometimes I get the feeling that nobody actually really wants me here, I realize now that's my inner critic talking. It's not a fair assessment of who I am. And so a lot of people in executive positions will have the internal capacities and abilities to do that. And then we shelve that. And I extend the invitation and I say, well, if you ever need to work on that, go find a good therapist, and I could make a recommendation for someone that you can go and see. But in terms of our coaching work, let's now look at the next steps that you implement within your workspace to achieve your goals.
So, Grant, I think in common with all or most other modalities of coaching, everyone is driving towards healthy adults, right?
Yeah.
That's a common focal point of most therapies. Sorry, of most, and that was an interesting Freudian slip because I said therapies. And it's because when I've been listening to you, it like blurs the boundaries for me between coaching and therapy. I mean, coaching is normally much more forward-looking. It looks to the future and adaptive behaviors, whereas therapy may, in some of its forms, certainly in the psychoanalytic ones, go into the origin of the states that people may experience later on in life. And I think the critics of those schools would say they're too deterministic. Sure, your ego states when you're a child, when you're vulnerable, when you don't have the protection, when you don't have the resources, cognitive, physiological, to kind of find a place for yourself in the world, you're much more vulnerable to all the vicissitudes that are happening. But as you grow up, you develop resources, you develop a way of navigating the world in a more functional way. And why would I, as an adult, be worrying about how I started out life as a vulnerable person, but now I'm much more functional? So I'm saying critics of this form would say, why go there? Rather focus on just adapting behaviors for the future towards the healthy adults.
Yeah, absolutely. And the critics wouldn't be wrong in terms of where you set the focus for the core of your intervention. But I'm very wary of setting people up for failure. And to a large extent, that is what has been happening in the coaching space, is that take the definition of self-leadership as being the change you want to see in the world. That is wonderful. Now, how do you realistically go and achieve that? The great thing about the Schema Theory framework is that it's in many ways come to counter the deterministic psychological theories that are in existence out there. So it's very humanistic. And it draws on the principles of humanistic psychology, which believes that everyone can change. And by the time that you are an adult, yes, you have developed certain capabilities because of that prefrontal cortex development that no doubt wasn't there when you may have been a traumatized child. So yes, naturally, you have resources and capacities that are already helping you as you navigate your complex life demands. We have to draw the distinction between the therapy and coaching. Although, Hilton, I'll be very honest with you. For me, that's a very difficult thing to do. And perhaps if I hadn't have my clinical psychology background, it might not have been such a big issue for me. But the lines do become blurry sometimes. It's about understanding and proper contracting, and understanding that your coach has got certain objectives and you've got a certain amount of time that you want to work on. So it is focusing on the workplace issues. It is about strengthening the healthy adult. But for me, if you have a decent understanding against what you are strengthening that healthy adult about, you can go and set your intervention at a level of, let's look at how you set boundaries. Let's look at how you become a bit more assertive and experientially set the focus there. But also having the avenue sometimes just to be able to say to people, if ever you felt ready and the need to take some of these other concepts of vulnerability and so forth that you might want to explore within a therapeutic space, that you can do that. Again, this is purely anecdotal, but this is one of the nice things about having conversations like this is you can share what you think. I think coaches fare better in executive coaching if they've had therapy before.
just listening to both you and Hilton positioning what the critics might say, the thing that comes to mind is it's all great in theory to think that you can live in your prefrontal cortex and be adult, but when we are stressed and we're triggered, then we know that that defaults to the limbic system, and we're then possessed by this life script. So, yeah, I think that if you can empower your coachees to understand why they keep defaulting, it can be life-changing for them. Yeah.
Absolutely. And for the critics, I think, Colleen, schema therapy often offers expertise in intervention that coaches could benefit from. And even coaches who don't have a psychology background, for instance, and aren't registered psychologists. I think this is why I feel so empowered when I work with people, is because through this approach, I've learned techniques and certain intervention formats that you could modulate to a certain level. I don't work on the level of trauma every day, not even within my clinical practice. So I think this theory offers pathways to intervention that coaches might find useful. So for instance, it's not like it's not happening. For instance, like chair work. There's lots of coaches that use chair work and they don't draw from schema therapy. There's lots of coaches who use imagery work, who draw on other approaches. What this modality could offer is enriching and enhancing the quality of delivery of those interventions. So I think it's a win-win. I think coaching without psychology in the background would be very limiting. But of course, we need to set the scene and understand at what level are we delivering. So yeah, getting into that limbic system that you're referring to, Colin, is essential.
Grant, maybe take us through like a typical chair work intervention. And I'm particularly interested also in whether it changes for you, whether you're working remotely or face-to-face.
So I find that most of the work, at least during the waves in the pandemic, a lot of the work was online and we had to adapt, and it's actually worked quite effectively. So to answer that question, online delivery with these kinds of methods, if you've got safety in terms of where you are, it could be in a quiet room in your car. If you've got good connection and decent sound and privacy, it works just as well. So just as dealing with the online modality. In terms of maybe getting a little bit of an experience of what I'm saying is something that you're interested, right? So let's say that we're now into like session 3. We've had the 360s. We've had the psychometry. I've had an opportunity to share a bit of a conceptualization, align that with your coaching objectives and building a strategy for how we're going to get there. And I'm saying, Hilton, I'm wondering if we could work with that inner critic that you seem to struggle with sometimes in the boardroom now that it's coming up for you. And I want us to do a bit of chair work around that today. And I say, well, can you think of something that happened maybe this morning or yesterday that was upsetting for you, that we could maybe use just as a bit of material for this chair work? So Hilton, I don't know if there was anything across your path that maybe you'd like to use it as an example.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I do have an example, because I think in the last few days, I found myself being pulled in 100 different directions and really almost overwhelmed with the amount of task switching that I had to do and the high demand and people waiting for things, and actually felt out of control just in terms of managing the demands
that's
of my
terrible,
day.
because I can see what you mean, where it starts to wear you down eventually. So I'd like you to imagine, you could close your eyes if it helps your imagination a little bit better, but just where you're sitting, I'd like you to picture yourself pulling up a chair and just sort of across from where you're seated now, and I'd like us to invite in that inner critic that can be so demanding. So I'd really like you to just picture this inner critic taking a seat across from where you are. Can you do that?
Mm-hmm.
What are you looking at right now? What are you seeing?
I'm looking at an image of a chair and trying to offload this kind of abstract image of a high demand version of myself.
And being a high demand version, I wonder, what's he dressed like? He's dressed in a suit.
He's dressed
Is it
in
one
a
of those
suit.
power suits? Yeah. Well, what color? Yeah. Okay.
Brown.
What about the way that he's sitting, his posture? Can you tell me about that?
Very authoritarian and legs crossed, confident.
Okay. Facial expression?
I guess a bit cynical.
Okay. Right. So I want you to hold that image, Hilton, but what I'd like to do now is I'd like to get to know this inner critic a little bit better. So I'd like to ask it a few questions, if that's okay with you, right? And
sure.
You can just let me know, because you can see his reactions and his responses. Just let me know what he's saying. But the first question I'd like to ask is, why are you in Hilton's life at this time?
Just to make things happen, to deliver on all the promises that we make.
So suppose I said to you, Mr. Inner Critic, that Hilton is quite capable, in himself to do that. I mean, he's got an MBA, he's a good business school. He's worked really hard in this company, and I think he'll be okay without you. How do you feel about that, Mr. Inner Critic?
Yeah, probably at times, but he can procrastinate and just get lost in diving into tasks that he's comfortable with and avoiding some of the stuff that he maybe feels less competent at.
It sounds to me, Mr. Inner Critic, that you don't have that much confidence and belief that Hilton is just going to be able to do what he needs to do.
I do in normal circumstances, but when there's a lot going on, I need to get him to focus.
So Hilton, just as you and I were doing this exercise, and I might even you can even open your eyes right now, but I'm just wondering, are you aware that as you were having this conversation that you're feeling anything right now?
Yeah, I feel a little bit like what you were saying earlier, that I'm kind of grateful that I've got a part of me that can just get into that mode. Yeah.
I was actually wondering if you feel something in your body a little bit more physically. Where do you feel it?
I feel tense.
So,
in my
Colleen, just a little bit of commentary. You'll notice that Hilton was going to start rationalizing and start siding and building an allegiance with this inner critic that we don't want. And I focused on his somatic system. And now I'm going to say, Hilton, all right, Hilton, I hear what you're saying about how he could be useful, but do you notice that your body disagrees?
I mean, I notice that, sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, disagrees is maybe a stretch for me. I notice that my body responds.
I agree that might be a stretch, but it seems uncomfortable. And it doesn't, the words of trusting this inner critic and how your body is feeling doesn't quite match. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, it's more adrenaline.
That's your little leader side, feeling somewhat uncomfortable with this inner critic sitting across from you that doesn't have a sense of belief in you, that implies that you're lazy and you procrastinate, and just really makes you feel awful about yourself. And so, Colleen, there's two directions that we could go now to highlight the point of the discussion. If this was therapy, I'd delve into the vulnerable child. I'd even go to a memory, that comes up that brings out these somatic feelings. On a coaching level, I'll say, Hilton, I think this is where we need to start activating some of your healthy adult, right? And what a healthy adult will do now is respond to Mr. Inner Critic sitting over here in his power suit, making all these demands of you. And I'm wondering, Hilton, what would you say to this inner critic? And you can sort of go into your imaginative world now where you just really see it with your eyes closed if you feel comfortable. Do you feel like you could give a response that's a little bit more healthy adult?
I'm not sure. In a way, like I said, I think that there's some value in having a part of me that can galvanize my inner resources to pull off things. So, I mean, like I related to what you said earlier, that like some people find their inner critics to have some kind of agency in their life, that it helps them to perform. So although it stresses me to do it, I mean, I feel like if I can get through the day and look back and know that I ticked a whole lot of things off boxes and didn't mess around, that's...
I actually agree with you. But just to see what it would feel like, could you close your eyes, look at this inner critic and sort of say those things to him? Remember what the little leader side of you is feeling, right? The little leader needs an adult that's going to get that across to the inner critic, right? So without your little leader having a voice, I think what's going to happen is, well, what you told me before, which is you take on all of these tasks, you burn out, it makes you look bad in the boardroom type situation. So I wonder if you'd be able to just kind of like try and set your limits and negotiate a bit of room for the little leader side of you. Would you be able to do that?
I mean, I suppose what I would say to my inner critic is I should be able to set the boundaries to not take on work that I can't accomplish. And rather, instead of getting into a space where there's, not enough hours in the day to do what you have to do, rather don't take it on in the first place. And that way you'll be able to manage your life much better without having to call on the resources.
So you notice the struggle. Now this proves what we said earlier, that self-awareness doesn't lead to change. Because all the stalling, all the circling around doing the chair exercise is just resistance, okay? And when he's finally getting into doing it, guess what he does? He becomes a second inner critic and he starts blaming himself and he's really stuck. So I would actually say, I would actually point this process out, just give him a little bit of time to digest this. And I would say, Hilton, I think your healthy adult needs a bit of coaching, needs a bit of training. So what I'd like us to do is I'd like to engage this inner critic, right? And set limits. And I just want you to listen in, right? And bring your little leader. Those tense feelings, that's okay. Just let them be there. Just let them hang around. And then let me have a word with this inner critic. All right. And then I'm going to try and keep it healthy adult myself. So I'm not going to go into attack. I'm not going to go into something disrespectful. Because remember, what's the idea of what you're doing? You're working on the cognitive system now with an activated sense of vulnerability. And that's difficult. You're helping people separate in a healthy manner from the inner critic parent mode, which looked after them, which fed them, which sent them to school, but was also very demanding. In a way that doesn't feel like you rejecting the inner critic parent, right? But that you are just creating a healthy sense of separation so that you can have your own identity and your own idea about performance.
I think I can see very much like Gestalt, it takes you to your different parts and your different voices. And there's no doubt in my mind that there's benefit in doing that because it gives expression to the parts of you that may be dominating in one way and more submissive in other forms.
And it sounds silly when you're not in the mode, but when you're experientially going through the process of it, you feel your body responding. You're feeling that sense of ease. And this is what we call self-regulation. And of course, in line with the other sort of psychological modalities, we want the coachee to become their own coach. We want the coachee to internalize this capability to work in high pressure situations and deal with complexity. And so this is one avenue. But I certainly take the point that in using schema theory, we aren't quite there yet, in terms of dividing the parameters between clinical and coaching work. I think a lot more research needs to go into that. And I actually wanted to tell you, just briefly, if we have time, about the work that Wendy Behari and Michael Watkins are doing. So they went into Wendy Behari being an experienced schema therapist, and Michael Watkins, a professor of leadership and organizational change at IMD Business School. And they actually went in with a schema approach with their MBA candidates. And firstly, they did a survey, because that's another thing that's great about this approach is there's so many tools to be able to measure and assess these schemas and these modes in quite an empirical way. And of course, what they found was very astonishing, that there's quite a high level of schema activation and dysfunctional coping modalities. And they've piloted a program which they call mode management, really, which we recognize as the need for therapy for most of us, but we're not going to go there within this business school environment. We're going to teach you mode management. We're going to teach you that when you feel those tense feelings and when you find yourself reacting in terms of that emotional hijack, we're going to give you concepts and tools to manage yourself through it. And so this chair exercise might be something that we will need to build on, and I will give some homework. And I'll say, now just watch that replay. And of course, what neuroplasticity tells us is that the more you pair up those images with feelings, neural pathways are being created that weren't there before. So I'm hoping that in some way this will add value to the coaching space and will enrich it. And people may not wholeheartedly adopt it the way I do, but you could incorporate it with some of the great things that you're already doing.
It sounds like a great addition to the toolkit, and something we need to look at doing for our coaches. I love the sound of mode management because it makes it sort of more contained, because obviously it's a long term. To really get to the bottom of your schema, I guess it's a very long journey. But as we come to the end of our time, the time has just flown. It's been amazing to chat and to see you work. I think we should start a different podcast, Grant doing his chair work. We'll get different people in to be in the chair. Any closing comments from you?
No, thanks, Grant. I didn't expect it to go there, but it was interesting and definitely had value for me.
I'd like to say thank you, Colleen, and to both of you for having me and just giving me a platform to share some of the ideas that I've become quite passionate about in the ways that I'm working.
Thank you for everything you've brought into our coaching circle. You bring a very different perspective and energy, and we really appreciate that influence in our organization. So thank you so much, Grant. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. We really hope you enjoyed the episode. It would help us a lot if you subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. Give us 5 stars if possible, and check out our website www.omnicore.co.za. You'll find our previous episodes and other blogs and helpful resources, and we look forward to connecting in the next episode.